This particular reading from the Gospel of Mark is the sort of story really that would make headlines in any tabloid newspaper today. It's got royalty, which, well, we know all about the royal family, don't we? You know, even no matter what you might think of them, or of the monarchy, everybody seems to be interested in a story about someone from the royal family. Relationships, especially illicit or broken ones, sex and scandal make the news, as we well know. Religion. Now, although God perhaps has slipped down the ratings a bit, God is still there, and whenever we hear of the misdemeanors or the misbehavior of some prominent church leader or somebody who says something in relation to their religious beliefs that offends someone else, in the present culture, of course, that also makes news. And especially when it's a person of authority, of course, which is very sad that God's own people that sometimes really let God down. So there's three ingredients really for a very good story if you want to dip into the tabloid newspapers. And if those three together, royalty, relationships, religion, those three together, locate them in first century Galilee, and you have the story of Herod and John the Baptist, which is headed in the Bible here as the beheading of John the Baptist. You've got murder as well as everything else. It's exactly the sort of thing, sadly, that people want to hear. We might pretend otherwise, but let's face it, most people do find it difficult to resist looking at a story like that when they see it, whether it be on social media or in the newspapers or on television. What happens at Herod's birthday party is scandalous. His stepdaughter is performing an erotic dance for his friends. He makes a rash, no doubt drunken, promise. And there's his command to execute the prophet to whom crowds of people are going to be baptized. These dark and negative forces lead to rash, unconsidered decisions and result in terrible and tragic consequences. John, of course, himself was not known for his tact, but he also spoke the truth. And so in Mark chapter 6, in verses 17 to 18, we read about what John actually had said to Herod. Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested, and he had him bound and put in prison. He did this because Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. Now, John had been saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have my brother's wife." So John had been speaking the truth to Herod. He'd been challenging him about what he had actually done. And as these dark kind of forces are at work, as we see in this story, it's good for us perhaps to reflect a bit on this account of what happened here, because we see the same things at work in our own lives. Scenarios can develop due to our actions, and especially when we're not prepared maybe to hear the truth. There's a lot to learn about how not to live, but also how to live. And as we've been thinking already, as we have a time in the service where we confess our sins to God, there's a very powerful word that really sums it up. And it's not a popular word today, but that is the word sin. Sin is like a poison. The wrong things that we do, the things that divert from the life that God would want us to live, they can be like a poison, and a poison needs an antidote. Because sin, this poison, it pollutes, it's powerful, it divides, and it leads to death. And I use the word poison because that's what it's like. When a poison gets into someone, whether they're bitten by a snake or whatever it might be, it can have deathly consequences because it goes right to this heart of the nervous system and it paralyzes. And that's what sin does to us. It paralyzes us in our lives. And I want to just look at three aspects of this story which come out as we read through this account. And the first one is grudges. In Mark 6:19-20, we read this. So Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But she was not able to, because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. So, obviously John was a person that Herod actually found quite challenging on the one hand, and he actually quite enjoyed listening to him talk, but at the same time, there was a kind of war going on inside Herod, really, because he knew that John was speaking truth. But has anyone here, for instance, held a grudge? Has anyone held a grudge against someone? Would you be able to raise your hand? I'm sure we all have. Now, maybe you're holding a grudge today, or maybe you've held a grudge for a long time. Grudges are feelings that, they can be quite trivial and small and we get over them, or they can become very deep-rooted and be like a poison within us, and they actually make it very difficult for us to move on in relationship with people. And so it's something that we can learn from this story today, is that grudges, when taken to their conclusion, can be very destructive indeed. And because Herod himself, he was listening to Herodias, the woman that he had married, that John had said he shouldn't have married, and she had a grudge, of course, and so against John, and this is what's at work here. There's this battle going on inside Herod where he wants to listen to Herodias, but he also wants to listen to John. And we can be in that situation too. It's like there's a war of words in our heads. And yet there's one thing that's the right thing to do, and that is not to harbour the grudge. But the longer it goes on, the harder it is to deal with it. But things can go on for a very long time, whether it be with friends or with family, just as it did with Herodias. And so sin, as I said a moment, sin is like a poison. It pollutes, but it also spreads. It spreads to other members of your family. If you've got a grudge against someone, other people are affected by it. They don't know who to listen to, who's right, who's wrong. So there's a challenge there about grudges. The second area that there's a challenge about is guilt. In Mark 6:21-23, finally the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. He said to the girl, "Ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you." And he promised her with an oath, "Whatever you ask, I will give you up to half my kingdom." Now, I presume he's quite drunk at the time. He's making a promise, perhaps, that he wouldn't want to keep. He finds out what she wants a little while later. But because of Herod's denial of the truth, he and all those around him are set on a path which is not going anywhere good. It shows weakness on Herod's part. It's weakness of the worst kind. He doesn't show courage in doing the right thing, and ultimately it leads to shame. As with all of us, it could have been so different. He makes a promise, but it results in an impossible choice. So, sin spreads because it started off as just a small thing, but it's getting bigger. And of course, we find out how big it gets in the next, what happens next. So, sin spreads and sin spoils. And that brings me to the third thing, which is guile. Now, the word guile, I don't know if anybody knows what the word guile means. I looked it up in the dictionary. The word guile means sly or cunning intelligence. To be sly or cunning, I think we'd all agree that to be sly or cunning might be sort of useful at times, to be cunning in certain situations. In the Bible it talks about being as wise as a serpent and as innocent as a dove. But being sly is not something that any of us would really want to be. In Mark 6:24-25, so she went out, this is Salome. Salome went out and she spoke to her mother. "What shall I ask for?" And her mother, of course, who held the grudge, said, "The head of John the Baptist." Herodias knew that she was putting Herod into an impossible position, because at least it was in the context of his culture. He'd also made an oath to God, before God, that he would keep the promise that he made. Now, we might say that there's a simple choice. You just say no. I mean, he's the king after all, isn't he? He could just not do it. But he's kind of in a bind of his own making. It's not so much, whether he did or didn't do it. It's just the process that led to this situation. That he had got himself into this situation by making a promise that actually was impossible to keep either way. And he's caught up in his pride, and he feels that he has to keep this promise. And so his action under pressure leads to a choice which, as someone has said, condemns a human being in order not to offend another human being or God, because he'd made it as a religious oath. So sin spreads, it spoils, and it separates. Sin results in destruction in that family, in that situation, on every level. And we have the ultimate separation. There's no undoing of what's happened as he issues the order for John to be executed. And he has to live with the consequences of that decision for the rest of his life. And it's the same with us. Decisions we make have consequences. Our choices have consequences. Within a decade, Herod has been banished to the land of Guile, which I think is France, far away from where he was living, left to die in disgrace in a distant land. And it's come full circle, because the victims of Herod's sin, they're faced with a choice as well, because do they forgive for what's happened? And that leads me now on to the three antidotes to the poison, in a sense, or which can be antidotes to that poison of the sins that have happened, the grudges, the guilt, the guile. And the first one is forgiveness. An antidote is a medicine taken or given to counteract a particular poison. When we take it, we start to feel better very quickly. And it's the same with forgiveness. as we receive forgiveness and as we give it, in what's called reconciliation. I'm sure all of us have experienced this, that when we really make up with a person, the joy of making up is so great. It's a wonderful feeling to be friends with someone again. In fact, you feel like, I know in my experience, you feel like you're a better friend than you were before. That's the miracle of forgiveness. As we receive it and give it, we start to feel better immediately, like the antidote. Our entire lives and attitudes can start to change. That's what happens when a person becomes a Christian. Their whole life starts to change. Their whole attitudes to the people that they work with, they live with, they interact with. And that brings me to the second thing, which is freedom. We experience freedom. And each one, in a sense, it's a bit like we hear about the vaccine, don't we? And, you're not as well protected if you have the first vaccine, if you haven't had the second vaccine. But if you have the second one, that builds on the first. And then you get a booster afterwards. So all of these things are actually, these antidotes, as it were, are part of the same thing. And so we experience freedom when we exercise forgiveness. And that's what we feel. We feel freedom as the burden of the guilt is lifted from us. There's some well-known verses in Isaiah 53, which are amazing verses because they speak long before Jesus was born, before Jesus came into the world. And in verses 4 and 6 of 53 it says this: "Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We like sheep have gone astray, each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." Those words describe Jesus. Because of his guilt, Herod kind of hoped, actually in a strange way, he hoped that Jesus was actually John raised from the dead. He actually thought that. It actually says that in the reading earlier on. It says that he thought that maybe this is Jesus, maybe this Jesus is John. He was guilty of this terrible crime of killing John, of granting the wish of Herodias. But the story isn't over, of course. John is dead, and Jesus must die, and he did die, but he also rose from death so that we could be free. And that brings me to the third point, which is really truth, and that is that John told the truth to Herod, and he paid the price. Jesus told the truth to the world, and he died for us. The more we forgive, the more free we will feel. The more free we are, the more truth we will tell. The more truth we tell, the more the kingdom of God will come. The more the kingdom comes, the better place this world will become. Through us letting go of our grudges, our guilt, our guile, and becoming forgiving people, living in freedom and in truth. Jesus said, "The Son shall set you free." He said, when the Son sets you free, you're free indeed.